While we have everyone joining us, I am Laura Chapman and I am the Communications Coordinator at the International Quilt Museum. We're located at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and we're home to the world's largest collection of publicly held quilts with objects from more than 65 countries and spanning 5 centuries. And you'll get to hear a little bit more about parts of that collection today as we get into our presentation. If this is your first time joining us, Textile Talks features weekly virtual presentations and panel discussions from the International Quilt Museum, the Modern Quilt Guild, Quilt Alliance, San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. These programs are held online at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific each Wednesday. We hope you will join us next week for the California Art Quilt Revolution, from the Summer of Love to the New Millennium with Nancy Bavor, presented by San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. You can visit internationalquiltmuseum.org/textile-talks to register, but we'll also provide more information about registration. Now, I would like to introduce today's presenter. Dr. Marin Hanson is Curator of International Collections at the International Quilt Museum. She is responsible for building and interpreting the museum's non-Western collection of quilts and related objects. She holds a Master's of Arts in Museum Studies and Textile History from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and she has a doctorate in Museum Studies from the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom. Dr. Hanson has curated a number of exhibitions at the museum, including Quilts in Common, around the world and across the centuries, and most recently, Glasnost and Folk Culture, Russian Quilts from the Turn of the 21st Century. She is a co-editor of American Quilts in the Modern Age, 1870 to 1940, the first publication in the museum's comprehensive series of collections catalogs, and she is the editor of our World Quilts website. Today, she will present Quilts in Common, What Can We Learn from World Quilts? If you have any questions for Dr. Hanson during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A by clicking the button that says Q&A at the bottom of the screen, or by typing them into the chat. With that, please welcome Dr. Hanson.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Laura. I am so pleased and honored to be here today to talk about a topic that I keep returning to in my career as a museum curator, this idea of quilts in common. It's a topic and it's a talk that I've given on numerous occasions. I try to tailor it every time, add something new, change it up a little bit, bring in some new quilts. And this time, I realized that I'm talking a lot about traveling around the world. And I thought, oh, maybe I need to remove some of that, considering the new world we're living in, the world that was thrust upon us so dramatically within the last few months. But I thought, no, I'm going to be optimistic, and I'm going to keep dreaming about world travel. So without further ado, this is my talk, Quilts in Common, What Can We Learn from World Quilts? As the International Quilt Museum's curator of international collections, I think a lot about traveling. Usually, to be honest, it's me craftily conspiring to get back to China, Japan, or India, or sneakily scheming to venture off to a new-to-me part of the world, like Uzbekistan, Nigeria, or Rarotonga. I willingly admit to my fondness for travel-based daydreaming. It's maybe something we all hold in common. But sometimes I find myself contemplating slightly more philosophical questions, like, why is international travel important? What do I, and by extension the International Quilt Museum, achieve by traveling abroad? And perhaps somewhat unexpectedly, why, when I travel to India, France, or China, is my top priority not to visit the Taj Mahal, Tour Eiffel, or Changchun? I guess the simplest answer to all three of those questions is quilts. My professional life is focused on quilts, and they are intertwined with my personal life as well. So when I travel, it's usually to study quilts, meet with quilt collectors, and connect with quilt makers and artists. That, of course, is only the most straightforward response. There are less direct, more circuitous answers I'd like to explore, using as touchstones the Rick Steves concept of temporary local and a theme that I, as I said, keep returning to in my curatorial life, something I call quilts in common. We all know Rick Steves through his ubiquitous European guidebooks and decades of PBS television travel programs. What I admire most about his approach to travel is his emphasis on exploring beyond the typical tourist spots, making deeper connections to a place, its people. In a blog post titled "The Ugly Tourist and How Not to Be One," Steves laments the over-reliance on air-conditioned tour buses, souvenir shops, voluminous luggage, and selfie sticks. He encourages travelers to forego, or at least limit, those things in an effort to remove barriers between themselves and the place and people they are visiting. He says, by developing a knack for connecting with people and their culture, we become temporary locals, approaching a new country on its level, accepting and enjoying its unique ways of life. When I'm in Europe, I strive to become what I call a cultural chameleon, a temporary European. I consume wine in France, beer in Germany, and when I get the urge for a good old-fashioned American breakfast, I beat it to death with a hard roll. I think we all enjoy his sense of humor as well. Now, obviously, he's not saying that drinking wine in France, beer in Germany, or for that matter, ouzo in Greece, sake in Japan, or baijiu in China, as personality changing as those activities can be, automatically bestows locals upon you. Consuming a country's favorite alcohol is, of course, a metaphor. Doing as the locals do is also a bit of a cliche, right? When in Rome. And yet, it prompts me to think about how, even when I travel for non-quilt related purposes, visiting top tourist spots is rarely the most satisfying part of my adventure. I sometimes wonder, why would I rather walk out of a hotel's front door and wander the neighborhood than hop in a taxi and head straight to that city's most famous landmark? Why do I love popping into convenience stores and open air markets, taking local transportation, and eating street food? And this will be my guiltiest confession. Why do I love watching local television, whether it's the news and weather report, a talent show competition, or a silly game show, preferably including inflatable obstacle courses replete with water hazards? Besides revealing my love of lowbrow humor and pop culture entertainment, I'd like to think it also speaks to what I now think of as my desire to become a temporary local. To me, being a temporary local is all about reveling in the ordinary, embracing the mundane, settling into a routine of being in that place, attempting to know a place, not at the surface level, but at a level that requires experiencing the everyday activities of getting around, acquiring sustenance, having fun with friends, and yes, maybe even watching a little television. In the end, it's about digging in and surrounding yourself with the details of daily life. I would argue that studying material culture, quilts most definitely included, can also help us transform into temporary locals. Over the past 4 decades, a range of scholars, including anthropologists, museologists, folklorists, archaeologists, geographers, and historians, have moved beyond what art historian Kenneth Ames called, quote, studying antiques or artistic objects as ends in themselves. That is the classic approach to artifacts, and moving toward cultures possessing rich potential for understanding the much broader contexts in which they were created. Among material culture's distinct and research-conducive characteristics are, according to Ames and historian Thomas Schlereth, primary evidential status, in other words, often being the only or only surviving evidence, longevity, three-dimensionality, representativeness, in particular of groups of people not otherwise represented by documentary sources, and a sensual as opposed to intellectual mode of understanding culture. Historians in particular have come to appreciate material culture's research potential. Schlereth, for instance, outlined 3 common scenarios for the use of material culture in research: when there is no other extant or surviving evidence, when material culture can be used to supplement documentary evidence, and when material culture can be used to refute long-standing or heretofore unquestioned arguments. These are extraordinarily important roles in historical research, which has traditionally been dominated by a reliance on documentary and textual sources. Quilts and textiles generally are excellent primary documents that provide data not to be found in written materials. Anthropologist Daniel Miller advocates in-depth object study by arguing that concentrating on a specific object helps avoid an over-reliance on theory. In other words, getting caught in a single mode of thinking, remote from the object itself. This method allows for approaches from a variety of disciplines, and it acknowledges the centrality of objects to culture creation. He encourages us to understand, or to attempt to understand culture, quote, through the study of what people do with objects, because that is the way the people that we study create a world of practice. All this talk of theory, to me, is another way of saying that through the extensive research of an object or group of like objects, we can become temporary locals. We can use their primary evidential status, their sensual nature, their representativeness to get in situ to the time and place in which they were created and used. Another fundamental aspect of being a temporary local while traveling is about finding connections, in particular, making sense of a new place by connecting your own experience. Every time I'm in a new country, or even one I've returned to many times, I always imagine myself living there. I can't help it. It simply happens without any conscious effort. And these are all photos I've taken in India on my several trips there. I absorb new information by comparing it to what I already know from past experience, and that inevitably sucks me into thinking about what it would be like to do this thing every day in this specific place. Similarly, finding connections between quilts, between quilt makers. In other words, making sense of a quilt by comparing it to other, possibly very different quilts, has always been, to me, the most interesting way to approach the study of quilts. In an article I co-authored with historian Janniken Smucker, finding a thematic connection between widely disparate groups of quilts was precisely our shared goal. Janniken and I used design historian Beverly Gordon's concept of material artifacts as points of interface between quilts made along the Amish English and global East-West axes. Janniken argued that many quilts made by the Amish, rather than confirming the stereotype of Amish social and cultural exclusion, could actually be seen as direct products of that Anabaptist group's interaction with their non-Amish or so-called English neighbors. And I maintained that mainstream American quilts of the last 2 centuries or more, rather than solely springing from homegrown American or antecedent European influences, often reflected Western fascination with Eastern cultures, whether Chinese, Turkish, Japanese, or Indian, and whether or not they were accurate portrayals in any way whatsoever. What was important was not simply identifying the points of contact as represented by quilts, but also fleshing out the larger socio-cultural issues that extended from them, ranging from colonialism to cultural appropriation. What was also important was observing how similar hybridizing processes took place in very divergent circumstances. So since I wrote that article, as I said, I've returned to the idea of quilts in common, and I've found that comparing quilts from wholly different backgrounds helps give me new perspective. For instance, in comparing 3 global textiles that can generally be classified as whole cloth quilts, I am struck by an interesting balance in each of them between precision and looseness, planning and spontaneity. The framed center format of the quilting in this Welsh piece and the symmetrically placed spirals, leaves, trefoils, and paisleys, sometimes called Welsh pears, give it a solid, structured feel. The quilting in Sujini Kanta is performed in a deceptively complex herringbone pattern, which visually and literally holds this piece together with its steady, predictable rhythm. Canadian artist Dorothy Caldwell's bright red running stitch in Four Fields Meet is a reflection of the influence Indian Kanta quilts have had on her work. Caldwell echoes and emphasizes the repeating Kanta stitch by painting the surface of the quilt with thousands of short stripes in all three whole cloth pieces. An element of unpredictability or flexibility is also present. The Welsh quilt maker, while using symmetry in her motif placement, seems to have drawn the quilting lines freehand, as there are slight variations between similar designs. The Bihari quilt maker, because she was working in the traditional way with recycled sari garments, included offbeat bursts of color and nonlinear pattern in her composition. And Caldwell, whose work explores themes of landscape and the impact of human activity upon it, emphasizes the idea that human settlement, even when planned along a grid, as it was in much of North America, often must honor the jogs and detours necessitated by the natural environment, with even the edges of her quilt refusing to follow straight lines. In another example of looking at a group of geographically or culturally unrelated objects, comparing these three square within a square quilts highlights how a quilt maker can exploit visual properties to create seemingly simple quilts with surprising depth. As contrasts in hue, value, and intensity cause the squares to visually advance or recede, one of the optical effects produced by their layered shapes is the illusion of space. For instance, in the case of this Amish center square quilt, the burgundy red center field appears to be floating above its green and brown background. The burgundy and green complementary colors create a powerful tension along the edges where they meet, generating a visual vibration around the perimeter of the burgundy square. This 19th century French wedding vane, a small piece made to lie on top of the bed, transposes the colors of the Amish quilt. The emerald green rectangle seems to hover over a shocking pink ground, and the appearance of depth is enhanced by the intensity and sheen of the silks. The piece is quilted in high relief, which is typical of this French style, and adds to its three-dimensional quality. The center square in contemporary artist Ruth Eisfeldt's work is composed of a series of identically shaped rectangles in an array of colors that transition from yellow-green to forest green to turquoise. The border, also composed of several rectangles, shifts subtly from a darker to a slightly lighter shade of royal blue. These color transitions appear, at least to my eye, to bring us from deep oceanic waters up to the shores and fields of the mythical island of Atlantis. Then they plunge us back to the depths to which the island subsequently sank. These two examples of comparing quilts from varied times and places focused on commonly held design elements and approaches. The next two relate to techniques and patterns that seem to have broad global appeal. The earliest known examples of paper cutting come from an archaeological excavation in China, the birthplace of paper, and date from the 4th to 6th centuries AD. As papermaking spread from China to the Middle East and then to Europe, many cultures adopted the art of paper. Today, many school children learn the basic fold and cut technique of making paper snowflakes to decorate their classroom in winter. Given the history and popularity of paper cutting, it's not surprising that it has been translated by many cultures into a quilt making technique. German immigrants to the US brought the art of Scherenschnitte, or scissor cuts, with them, and they expanded its use beyond the traditional decoration of birth certificates, Christmas ornaments, and love letters to the creation of fabric applique motifs. By folding her pieces of brick red cloth into eighths and cutting specific designs along all edges, The maker of this Scherenschnitte quilt produced finely wrought tulips, hearts, and curlicues, common Pennsylvania Dutch motifs. European and American missionaries brought Western-style quilt making to the Hawaiian Islands in the late 19th century. Although no firm documentary evidence has yet been found, missionaries also may have brought paper cutting as well as Scherenschnitte style quilts to Hawaii. In whatever way they were introduced to the technique, by the 1870s, Hawaiian women began to create fold and cut applique motifs. American Scherenschnitte quilts, however, Hawaiian quilt makers covered the entire surface of their quilts with a single large motif rather than a series of smaller ones. They also looked to native vegetation, such as breadfruit and silversword, for inspiration in creating their cutout motifs, transforming a quilt practice they had acquired from outsiders into a quintessentially Hawaiian art form. Patchwork, embroidery, and applique all figure prominently in Raleigh, a traditional quilted textile of Western India and Eastern. Frequently employed applique technique for Raleigh involves folding a piece of fabric into quarters or eighths and cutting out a design, such as camel tracks or butter churn. One significant difference between Scherenschnitte or Hawaiian applique and Raleigh quilts is that even to this day, many women do not own scissors and instead use a razor blade to create their designs. The Raleigh are used for a variety of purposes, as bed coverings, temporary walls, prayer rugs, cushions, and storage bags. It seems natural that people all over the world translated one form of folk art, paper cutting, into a fabric-based practice. What is wonderful is how, despite the repetition in in technique, each quilt tradition remains firmly rooted in its own culture. And I'm going to slow down here because I've been told that my audio is maybe backing up a little bit. Okay, so the log cabin pattern, 3 of which you see here, is a design that can be seen in cultures all over the world. In these 3 examples, we see the maker's innovative use of the relatively simple design to create dynamic, almost frenetic compositions. This late 19th century American quilt seems to buzz with barely suppressed energy. The maker, like all log cabin makers, used value contrast to her advantage, creating the chimney and cornerstone setting by alternating dark, somber fabrics with bright orange, blue, and white ones. More importantly, she used a technique that we've frequently noted in the IQM collection, placing striped fabric logs on the bias to create a barber pole effect. In Central Asia, log cabin blocks in what we would call the pineapple and the courthouse steps settings are ubiquitous. A tushtuk, or tent hanging, in our collection amply demonstrates their popularity. The black triangles we in the West would call wild goose chase are considered amuletic, representing feminine fertility, and the triangular motif is repeated in the pineapple log cabin blocks that dominate the tushtuk's sides and top. The small courthouse steps blocks that you see in the center are called stars, a fact that confused me until I saw them in conjunction with one another. Placed as they are in a 9-patch format, they form an 8-pointed star. Although the log cabin design as it is seen in contemporary Japan came from the US, Japanese quilt makers have developed novel approaches that turn the pattern into something wholly different. Shizuko Kuroha is known for experimenting with the log widths on each diagonally divided half of the standard log cabin block. In this example, she enlarged the logs on one half by a factor of 2, creating off-kilter blocks that contribute to the swirling, hectic aesthetic she aptly has titled Confusion. And I hope in that detail that you can see the difference in the width of the logs down near the bottom as compared to the ones on the other diagonal half of the log cabin block. That's how she creates that very swirling effect. So admittedly, this thematic, wide-ranging approach that I'm taking runs the risk of treating objects superficially, of reducing them to a handful of physical characteristics, or of implying a direct or more direct connection between them than is actually present. In fact, this exercise could turn into an example of Daniel Miller's, quote, over-reliance on theory. I would like to argue, however, with those caveats in mind, that searching for quilts in common can actually spark the researcher to dig deeper into each individual object and possibly view it differently in counterpoint to others. I, for one, have considered the Amish center square and French divan differently, looked at them side by side. I've thought about how the Amish wool and the French silk softened or heightened the optical illusion of floating, and how the varying degrees of stuffedness created visual subtlety or drama. Both of these physical characteristics led me to contemplate the socio-cultural environments in which they were created, the relatively austere Amish atmosphere and the lively French wedding. Examine the quilted border motifs more closely. Although in the same feathery curvilinear family, one is refined and understated, while the other is lively and self-assured. Sure, I could have noticed and contemplated those characteristics in isolation, but the contrast is what heightens the distinctions and the similarities. So this last group of quilts in common I'm going to share with you looks at the ways in which quilt makers have explored abstractions, concepts and ideas that can be expressed in a variety of visual formats using a range of techniques. And Laura Chapman, I'm assuming you will let me know if my audio is still cutting out. So in this last group, I'm looking at the concept of identity. Identity, the sum of qualities that characterizes and distinguishes each human being as an individual distinct from all others, is revealed in various ways, ranging from a one-of-a-kind human fingerprint or DNA sequence to an individual's actions, clothing, or personality. Identity can be framed by one's gender or culture, or demonstrated through deliberate manifestations like art, writing, and music. This famous pictorial quilt by Lucinda Ward Honstein of Brooklyn, New York, portrays both her individual identity as well as the larger social components of her life in the tumultuous years following the Civil War. In separate vignettes, Honstein reveals intimate details of her family's life. A young woman riding a black horse may represent Honstein's daughter, Emma. Honstein's red brick Brooklyn home is portrayed in the center of the quilt, with an American flag flying and the yard teeming with a variety of farm animals. Honstein's quilt also expresses the social and political identity of Brooklyn in 1867, the year the quilt was completed. Other images refer to the Civil War. For instance, a black man facing a white man half his size proclaims, "Master, I am free." As powerful a declaration of identity as I have ever seen, and one whose reverberations are still being felt today. And it's a concept that encompasses our individual lives as well as the larger social and political influences that play upon them. Honstein's album quilt explores personal identity and social and cultural identity in a manner similar to contemporary artist Faith Ringgold, who explores the various identities of Black women in The Women Mask Face Quilt #1, through images of women's faces and disconnected torsos. The figures are placed in a grid that, like a children's matching game, appear able to be shifted and moved, interchanging faces and bodies. The quilt communicate to me how racism and sexism create stereotypes that subvert the individual's unique qualities. Ringgold's titular reference to masks also alludes to the way human beings often hide their true identity as they move through society. And yet, I always take hope from the specificity and the individuality Ringgold brings to each face and body. She celebrates the humanity of each woman, self-confident presence. If Ringgold had made this quilt today rather than in 1986, I like to think that one of the women would be wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. Barbara Wattler's fingerprint series takes a literal approach to the expression of identity. Magnified fingerprints created in stark black and white emphasize the whorls and lines that shape each unique human signature in its most basic and natural form. About this work, Wattler has said, "My search for images of identity brought fingerprints immediately to mind. Enlarging them was an appropriate way to pay homage to ordinary people who feel a loss of identity in today's techno world. There is an inherent honesty in these natural designs. It invites viewers to see in a new way." New way, as Wattler puts it, is what I'm hoping the idea of quilts in common helps us do. For scholars and researchers, anything that aids in shifting paradigms and broadening perspectives is potentially useful. Additionally, by recognizing some of the universal design ideas, technical approaches, and conceptual or emotional content that humans have long explored through their quilts, we can see those makers and their cultures not being isolated from others, but part of a larger or interconnected world. An example of global interconnectedness was demonstrated to me in a delightful way last year on social media. We had posted an image of our exhibition, Cheddar Quilts from the Joanna S. Rose collection, with a bright Irish chain quilt in the foreground. A dealer and collector from Rajasthan, India, who we sometimes work with, posted, "This quilt is from the Thar Desert, an arid region that straddles the border between Rajasthan and Sindh, Pakistan." I responded to Santosh, "It looks like it, doesn't it? But this one is actually American. Isn't it wonderful how universal designs bring us together?" And he replied, "Really? Wow, thanks for letting me know." This anecdote of finding unexpected connections brings me to my final and most deeply felt point. And in making it, I'm going to return to travel metaphors and to using Rick Steves as a crutch. In his book, Travel as a Political Act, Steves writes, "My travels have taught me to have a healthy skepticism towards those who peddle fear. Fear is a tool used to keep a people down. And in so many cases, I've learned that fear is for people who don't get out much. The flip side of fear is understanding, and we gain understanding through travel." My goal with every exhibition I curate or co-curate is to help IQM visitors see themselves, even just a little bit, in global quilt traditions, to find a connection to unfamiliar people and places. I see it as a form of virtual travel, the political kind of travel with a lowercase p, that allows us to constantly revisit, revise, expand, or reconfirm our values, especially with regard to how we regard and relate to the rest of humanity. In Sacred Scraps, which you see here, Quilt and Patchwork Traditions Central Asia, my hope with guest curator Chris Martins was that visitors would see how Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Tajik, and Turkmen people use patchwork much in the same way we do, to celebrate weddings and births, to mourn the loss of family members, and to decorate and give meaning to our everyday lives. In From Kente to Cuba, stitched textiles from West and Central Africa, I aimed to point out similarities between traditional African textile techniques and the ones American quilt makers use, like strip piecing, again providing a hook of familiarity with which to grab audiences. And in collecting and recollecting contemporary quilts in Western India, my goal was to facilitate feelings of connection and familiarity via the telling of stories. The stories of Ramji Devraj Gordia, who started a quilt making business with his brothers after the devastating 2001 Gujarat earthquake and was scorned by his neighbors for doing women's work until they saw that his business had become successful to employ 150 local quilt makers. And of Permaben Maheshwari Dangera, who didn't follow traditional quilt patterns and eventually stopped showing her quilt for being laughed at. And of the anonymous Joshi fortune teller's wife, who created a stunning quilt based on a motif she saw in her everyday life, the Kundali astrological fortune-telling chart. And of the Sidi women, descended from enslaved Africans who formed a quilt-making cooperative to earn money for their grandchildren's school fees, their family's crop seed, and their village's farming equipment. With collecting and recollecting, I also undertook a bit of very likely statistically insignificant survey, which I'm going to share with you anyway. During the exhibition's tenure, we presented several talks, after which I requested that audience members briefly gauge the impact of the makers' quilts and stories, asking them to rate these two statements. The Indian quilts I saw today will inspire my own creative activity or quilt making, and I relate to the stories in the exhibition of quilts from Western India. On National Quilting Day in March 2019, I talked to over 100 people at 2 separate presentations, and 55 of them filled out the survey with the average answer for both questions being 3.9. After Patricia Stoddard and Martha Wallace, guest curators for the exhibition, gave a talk in June of that year, 14 audience members rated each question an average of 3.7 and 4.5 respectively. And last fall, I presented to a group of 20 quilt makers in Tokyo, Japan, who, perhaps because they wanted to please their foreign guest, gave each statement a whopping average of 4.5 and 4.75. Whatever the shortcomings of my survey method, I believe that at the very least, my asking the questions solidified ideas in the participants' minds of quilts and quilt makers from an unfamiliar part of the world. Here are some of the answers they gave to the question that closed the mini survey. What is your biggest takeaway from learning about Indian quilts and quilt makers? Very interesting stories, very different from my own experience. I've never seen those quilts before. I was moved by the story of Permaben. Keep on creating and believe in yourself. We focus on straight and squared. Now I'll be more flexible. I do like to make crazy quilts. Creativity doesn't require much. Resources can come from anywhere. Quilting connects cultures, people, families. Women are incredible. They work on farms and fields, and then they come home and quilt. These are some of the most joyous quilts I have ever seen. Happy quilts. This one was quite personal. My cancer doctor is from India. We will be talking about this at my next visit. And because it was impossible for everyone to be impressed, someone not artistic. Fair enough. We can't please everybody. In the end, I hope that audience members and exhibition visitors, perhaps excepting a few, felt that they had become temporary locals, however briefly. I hope they felt empathy, inspiration, excitement, and curiosity. These are all pathways to gaining understanding and expelling fear of other. I feel an obligation to study world quilts, and especially to interpret them with the explicit aim of helping museum visitors feel more comfortable with potentially unfamiliar cultures. Part of that process is humanizing the makers and, in some cases, the subjects of the artwork. One example of that, which I was not a part of, was the Los Desconocidos exhibition we hosted, co-curated by the IQM's Jonathan Gregory with Jody Ibsen and Peggy Hazard. The importance of telling the stories of the people who have perished in the Sonoran Desert attempting to cross into the US cannot be understated. Helping visitors become comfortable with unfamiliar cultures can also include consulting non-traditional sources. For instance, in striving to curate from Kente to Cuba from a temporary local standpoint, one of the things I did was to read a number of novels by West African authors. Africa is not in my academic wheelhouse. My research background has mainly focused on the US and Asia. So in addition to gratefully receiving guidance from a number of African textile collectors, I dived not only into texts by textile scholars, but also into popular literature, particularly from Nigerian authors Chinua Achebe, the University of Nebraska's own Chigozie Obioma, and Chimamanda Adichie. The first two helped with my beginning to understand the complex cosmology and cultural and religious practices of the Igbo people. The latter, Chimamanda Adichie, provided a cross-cultural Africa-US perspective, particularly in her novel, Americana, about a young woman who is forced to straddle and reconcile her Nigerian and American identities and existences. Recently, I watched a 2018 talk by Chimamanda Adichie in which she expressed this thought: having confidence in your culture does not mean being ethnocentric. It does not mean that you think your culture is better than others. It simply means that you are satisfied with what is yours, and there will be no need to tear others down, no need to demonize other cultures that you don't understand. In fact, to be secure in who you are means to be able to admire other cultures. We are at a moment as a society when we need to stop demonizing other cultures. There is too much of that going on already. What is happening in the world politically, with a big P, must not tempt us into vilifying entire ethnic, national, or religious groups. It may seem small in the grand scheme of global affairs, but I am proud of the IQM exhibitions that have introduced the material culture, the everyday objects, the soft, warm, approachable, functional, quirky, beautiful quilts of people from places we sometimes fear, like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Nigeria. I am proud to study quilts as a way to explore and understand our global shared humanity. The world is a big place, but I passionately believe we can find ample connections, people to people, and quilts, I feel, are often what we hold in common. Thank you. And
Maren,
yes.
sorry, we do have a few questions. I also just wanted to share with anyone who didn't see it in the chat. We do know that there is sometimes some audio issues as we're all distant, but there will be a recording of this lecture available later, and a lot of times those audio issues are resolved, and so you'll receive notification of that. We also had a question about how you can find out about future Textile Talks. In addition to the website, you will also, by being present here today, by having signed up for this lecture today, you will also receive notification of how to register for the next one. with that, we did have a few questions that I'd like to share with you, Marin. We had some questions about the size of some of the quilts that were in the exhibition, primarily the fingerprint quilts, and we did have an answer provided by our director of 35.5 by 35.5 inches. But also I would just recommend that most of our quilts, all of the quilts that were actually shared in today's presentation, you can find on our website as well with additional information. But for you, Marin, I was wondering, we have a question from Sylvia who asks, how has traveling, meeting, and viewing all of these cultural pieces affected your own creative process?
Oh, well, all of the traveling and collecting and researching I do sadly means that I often don't have a lot of time for my own creative process. But certainly I collect fabrics while I'm traveling. So fabrics often from far-flung parts of the world often make it into pieces I'm working on. I would never call myself an artist. I do make quilts, but lately, like so many of us, I've primarily been making masks for family, friends, and for my local community, which is a very small town in Northeast Iowa. And I apologize for any audio issues we might have been having. Sometimes our local internet connectivity is not at its peak. So as Laura said, hopefully if you missed anything from my talk, you can see it in the recorded version, which I know she'll be sending out links to or providing in some form. So yeah, travel has certainly affected the amount of time I have for making, which is not enough.
We have a follow-up question to that. Why wouldn't you call yourself an artist?
Yeah, I guess, that's a very, very good question, because I often argue that women who are making quilts and are not self-consciously call themselves artists, I sometimes would argue that they have artistic impulses. So humans, regardless of training or formal background, we all find beauty in the world and we want to make beauty in the world. So I guess I actually do have an art degree, so I could call myself an artist, but I don't make objects that I see as primarily aesthetic. I see them as primarily functional, and I know that there are so many discussions about the fact that functional and aesthetically considered, those things can coexist. But yeah, I think you have prompted me to think a little bit more about how I define myself when I'm making quilts.
Another question is, how do you make the connections with native quilters?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, my research background has primarily been off the shores of the United States. I'm assuming you mean native North American groups of people, and I have not studied those quilts as closely as I have studied the traditions of people in, say, Asia or Africa. But I can definitely see how certainly hybridizing processes have gone on. When you look at what the amazing things that Sioux artisans have done with the Lone Star quilt pattern, that was a pattern that has sort of filtered down through the ages and was adopted as a patchwork form by Sioux women. And they've taken it and really run with it and made it their own. So I can definitely see how native forms of patchwork and quilt making can fit into the quilts in common paradigm.
We have another question that is, cultural appropriation is concerned at the moment. How do you feel a maker should deal with this?
Boy, yeah, that is a really, really tough one. I think, some of the bigger pitfalls to look out for are, are you honoring another culture, or are you merely taking symbols, fabrics, and just incorporating it willy-nilly into your own work? I think honoring the other culture And that means, you know, doing the work, doing the research, finding out precisely how fabrics were used originally. I think all of that research, all of that engaging with the original practices is important. Um, and yeah, I think you just need to do the work.
And there's a follow-up question to the previous one. It's in meeting the local makers when you're traveling abroad.
Uh-huh.
How do you make connections with the makers when you're in China or in
Oh, you
India,
mean
etc.?
like the practical aspect of that?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, it can happen in so many different ways. We've been so fortunate to be connected with really wonderful and really well-informed researchers. I named a few of them who have been co-curators or they've worked with us on a number of projects. Chris Martins, I hope you're still on this. I think you were going to be joining us. Trish Stoddard, Martha Wallace. These are people who have lived and traveled in the areas where we are interested in collecting, and they are the people who really help us connect with people on the ground. My own background is in Chinese studies, so connecting with universities that have relationships with the University of Nebraska, that's been super helpful. That helps us find other researchers in China who are looking at patchwork practices. So it's a real, you have to be flexible. You have to connect with lots of different people in lots of different ways. The world is obviously a very big place. So yeah, using lots of different methods and lots of different connections.
And then we've had a couple of questions about craft versus art and how do you address this idea? And someone also then went on to add, does the art versus craft distinction have any importance in your thinking?
Oh,
Would you have a way of
yeah.
distinguishing the two?
Yeah, and I guess that is a follow-up to sort of the person asking me why I don't call myself an artist. I guess I have been so interested traditionally in what would be called, what I guess in an old school way would be called ethnographic textiles. And those are like deeply rooted textile traditions in different cultures around the world where those distinctions just aren't that relevant or haven't been. Obviously, we're in a much more globally connected time now. But in the past, you know, women weaving on a backstrap loom or doing patchwork or making felt in Mongolia or, you know, there was no need to make the distinction between craft and art. And so I guess I've skirted that issue mainly because what I'm most interested in is what are the stories that they tell? What are the stories of the makers? Um, Obviously, I think that they had values, they had aesthetic opinions. Does that make it art? Maybe, but that's less important to me than just learning about how that practice functioned within that society or for that individual. Um, so I'm probably not really answering the question, but that's because, yeah, I think for a lot of the textiles I've been most interested in, those arguments haven't been terribly relevant.
And we have, I'll do two more questions that we have right now. One of the questions is, have you seen any evidence of modern day life being included in quilts from more unstable cultures? For example, carpet makers in Pakistan were including weapons in their designs in the early 90s.
Oh, well, I mean, another obvious example of that would be Hmong story cloths, um, which tell the, you know, the horrific story of being essentially murdered in their own country and having to, the Hmong people being murdered in their own country, being targeted for having engaged in the CIA's secret war and then having to go live in refugee camps and then eventually moving to the US. I think, you know, those story cloths really, those are sort of like of the moment documentary um, objects that really, yes, reflect uh, absolutely modern or present day topics and issues. So I mean that's an example that immediately comes to mind. But I mean throughout history, quilts and textiles generally have been very timely, have addressed topics of the day. And I would encourage you all to go to our World Quilts, The American Story website, because we have a whole section that addresses, how quilts have been used, whether it's in a political fashion or in a, addressing social disparities or issues. So I think that that's a tradition that has come down, for generations, using textiles that way.
Great. And then just the last one we had is about a project someone is working on. It says, I'm working on a presentation that involves a crazy quilt. What would you contrast, compare to highlight the important points of the crazy quilt?
Well, once again, I will recommend that you visit our world site. It's worldquilts.quiltstudy.org. There is a whole module, a whole component devoted to crazy quilts. And what we're proud of in that module, working with Dr. Susan Marks of the UK, we were able to sort of look at crazy quilts from both sides of the Atlantic, to look at what the differences were in the UK as compared to the US in terms of the aesthetic makeup of crazy quilts. How were they the same? How were they different? Marketing and promotional materials. We definitely found that in the US there was a lot more marketing emphasis rather than in the UK. So I think that's one resource I would point you to in looking at this quilts in common approach to crazy quilts, because crazy quilts, a lot of people think, oh, they're American, they're late 19th century American, but really that aesthetic of sort of the haphazard patchwork, it's not just in the US. And we try to find connections to lots of different parts of the world on that site. So I would encourage you to check that out, as well as the other World Quilts modules.
All right, and that is all the questions that I have for right now. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's Textile Talk. We hope you will join us for next week's as well. Look for an email coming with more information about how to register for the future talks, and also for the ability to watch a recording of today's lecture. With that, thank you, Marin, and again, thank you to everyone who came.